I'm Art Harris, back at the United Astrologers Congress with three of the superstars of astrological forecasting in the business sector. These are the people you want to call before you call your stockbroker and before you call your bank. And Grace, you really called it out this last week on Facebook. Leading up to one of the biggest IPOs in history, you had a prediction, and what was that?
Well, first of all, Facebook, the IPO began before a solar eclipse, which was bad news to begin with. Any project started before a solar eclipse has a handicap. It's much better to wait till after the solar eclipse. But I looked at the time for that Friday, and May 18th, and the markets open at 9:30 a.m. So that's when we usually set up a birth chart for first trade. And 10:45 would have been a much better time for them to have begun trading. They didn't begin trading until 11:30 a.m. So it sets up an entirely different set of circumstances, and I think one of the things that might have created problems as they've gone on is the Mars-Neptune opposition, because clarity is not associated with that particular pattern. So they're both the way they do their financing and so many other factors may be a problem in the years ahead.
What you had actually said earlier when I read was that had they sold the stock, started at that time, which you said closer to
10:45.
10:30, right? Or 10:45 was your time.
10:45. Mm-hmm.
What would be the difference now?
Well, it would put such things as the Sun-Jupiter, which is a very favorable combination when those two factors are involved. And it would have been more powerful, and that Mars-Neptune I just mentioned would have not been in a prominent position, so that it might not have been something the public was aware of. And that's pretty important if you're going to have full disclosure, so to speak, in a company's
the
stock.
financiers, the brokerage firms should have called you. You could have helped avoid a Justice Department investigation
That's
had
right.
they sold earlier, right?
And I've worked with many clients to set up their first trade, make sure they start at the right time, and the incorporation dates. In our state of Illinois, you can be right there on the spot as you sign, and I've had clients either fly down or go into the office even ahead of time to make sure that the incorporation is signed at the right time. I can use an example of what a difference when you sign at the wrong time makes. Microsoft had a wonderful incorporation chart, and they decided to reincorporate in the mid-1990s. And a week after they reincorporated, the Justice Department called at their door, and they stayed in litigation, and their stock, which had been a steady climb up, flattened, and it's pretty much been flattened since. So if Bill Gates would like to change that course, he might reincorporate.
Arch, tell me, how would you describe what you do in, quote, reading the stock market? You're one of a kind.
Well, I've had a newsletter predicting the stock market generally, and I also mention oil and gold and the dollar index, whatnot, whatever people are interested in at the time. But I was a technical market analyst. I started watching the market when I was 13 and trading when I was 14. And I was marking a chalkboard in Merrill Lynch in Raleigh, North Carolina, when I decided this is what I want to do, send me to New York. And they said, don't be ridiculous. So I stayed there 6 months, and I said coming up to Labor Day weekend, I said, I quit. I'm going to New York and look for a job. And they said, don't do that. We'll transfer you. So they transferred me right up into the research department. Fortunately, business was booming at that time. We had just passed the volume limit maximum that we had in 1929 in April of 1961. And so I ended up in New York, and I was spending nights in the library looking up 10-day moving averages of every figure in Barron's Financial Weekly and the Wall Street Journal. And that's how I got my start. And the technical guy there had only been there 2 or 3 years before I had been there. And he was hoping to get an assistant. And so I turned out to be his first assistant ever. And he turned out to be the best known and best respected technical analyst in Wall Street for his entire career.
Did he know, though, that you were a secret astrological
Calculator.
I wasn't.
You weren't.
But
did you use that in advising him?
No.
No?
I read about it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal while I was his assistant. And I started doing statistics on it. And of course, no one else much was interested. But I think the crash of 1962 was partially to do with that big alignment that Jean Dixon always talked about. She was the psychic in Washington, D.C. And I think that caused the drop. It was making a big head and shoulder top pattern technically. And the day it broke the neckline was the day that Kennedy made the steel companies roll back a price increase. And so I think the whole crash was to punish Kennedy.
Tell me, though, now you have, 40 years later, you have this newsletter. What do you see as the reasons for the market crash and then the reboom, and how are things looking in the near and long-term future?
Well, I've done so much work with these things, and I looked at them very carefully. When we have big patterns involving several planets, something big always happens on the Earth, and it does not always affect the stock market. But some very big items, the first harmonic convergence date in '87 ended up being the top day in the stock market because it was a 5-body conjunction within 2¼ degrees at the tightest in at least 800 years that I checked. And I predicted that would be the market high and that the market would crash after. And so that was what made my name in Wall Street.
That's right.
Were you quoted in some, like the Wall Street Journal, things like that? Were you?
I've been quoted in Barron's, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the New York Times.
What did it feel like to be an astrologer and to have some respect?
Well, as I say, I was a Wall Streeter before I was an astrologer, so I used technical market analysis quite thoroughly and knowledgeably, hopefully.
Yeah. What do you see now?
What I see now is that all astrologers are talking here about the Uranus-Pluto square, which is a long-term pattern, and it will last for 3 to 4 years, and it tends to occur during major depressions and major wars. So it's not a pleasant picture to look at the future, but remember that we've lived through the best times on the planet ever, in the best place on the planet ever. So we've had wonderful lives, and that may be becoming a little harder, but it might, whatever happens, may bring us closer to human values, a little bit back in from what's published on TV and what everybody is looking at for the latest fad. That might go by the boards.
May have less money, but more time to spend with the family.
Yes, exactly.
So learn how to do it well. Georgia, tell me what you do and what your predictions are.
Well, I've been a business astrologer since the late 70s. And I actually didn't plan to do this. It sort of came. I come from a family of real estate and land investors, and that's what I was supposed to do, but I didn't. And but I found a correlation between the cycles of land and property and trends. I'm very good at setting trends, and when I work with my clients, I work with them in terms of where they're at now, where the windows of opportunity are, because regardless, I think, of what's going on, and I do think we are still in a severe decline as far as land, and not land, but real estate, homes, and property. I think we still have another 5 years. About 25% still the houses are low. They're saying a lot of homes right now are being sold, and that supposedly the real estate boom is changing, but I think it's only because it's a 3% rate, and the rents have gone very far up, and people have a place to live, but the unemployment is not going to improve for a while either. So what I try to do is see the window of opportunity when I look at somebody's chart or somebody's company's chart, and I also set company charts up for people who are starting. I have an MBA, and I have lectured all over the world, and I do a lot of research, and I get really excited about the new technologies. Not so much the digital, but the way you can use digital, for example, say in the Midwest with land. You know, there's a lot of land in the Midwest. That's the breadbasket of the United States, and I thank God we have that. We're 50 countries instead of 50 states. And they are now managing their land with more solar power in case the weather changes, and the weather will be changing a lot. And they're actually managing irrigation with GPS now. I mean, there's a lot of changes happening.
So looking at your quote portfolio, if you have some big buildings that are empty.
You mean commercial buildings?
Commercial buildings, say. What do you tell?
You got my eye. You got my eyes, right? Well, what would I say to those people? Well, what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to dump them? You're going to walk away? I mean, it depends on what your portfolio says. I mean, if you're just a little underwater, I would not get rid of it. I'd say maybe to lower your rents. The problem, and I think that would be a very smart thing to do, because people have gotten very greedy with rents, both for residential and commercial. They're asking way too much money, and if they lowered the rents, they would fill them up. I mean, I think this is what we have to come to, is some sort of equilibrium, because people are getting greedy again. I mean, a home that's 60 years old, of course I'm from Northern California, so it's a little bit more money there, but whereas it was $1,200 last year for rent, it's now $2,800. In 1 year.
In San Francisco and around that area?
Around that area, yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, people are getting greedy.
And so houses are not selling. Is that one reason?
Houses are selling because they're not selling as much as they could be if we had a different climate, if we had more employment. But they are selling because they've lowered the rates to a beyond realistic low rate. Beyond realistic.
Tell me, Grace, how do you see the market?
Well, I deal in sectors, so no matter which way the market's going, although I'm always an optimist since the beginning of the markets, with all the pullbacks, which are buying opportunities, the sectors that have done really well in the last year, in the Jupiter and Taurus, the food, beverage, and restaurants have really started to pull back. Green Mountain Coffee is a good example, and Chipotle evidently is starting to run into problems. And we'll see that whole sector pull off certainly by June 13th when Jupiter goes into Gemini, and we see a greater emphasis on the media. Warren Buffett just bought 63 newspapers, and people thought he was a little off for doing it, but I think he's just right on. He bought it from Media General, the company, and that's definitely the sector that will now come into favor, as well as airlines. I looked at the charts of American and United Airways sometime back and wrote in my stock market newsletter that they definitely will be, if not merging, U.S. Airways will be buying American Airlines. And the railroads will continue to be good, especially Union Pacific. And,
okay, Arch, final prediction.
Well, some
buy, sell, or hold.
I'm a seller, and going one leg different and selling short, betting on the downside for the remainder of this year. Because there's some big patterns in June and July, and then again around the fall equinox. And then there's the Mayan date coming up, which I learned to respect, because that last Mayan date was the top day in '87. So I'm a little cautious, more than cautious. I'm a little more aggressively negative.
So get out of the bounty that the stock market has brought you if you have been a winner, get liquid.
Yes, and if for those with the knowledge and the ability to do so, to bet the downside, I don't recommend options, but because a lot of people don't understand them, and that's dangerous. But if you can understand that and use a small part of your funds, I wouldn't be against the negative bet, actually.
Georgia, you're an investor and a holder of real estate. Buy, sell, or hold?
Buy land. Buy land, because, yes, commodities, the Chinese, they need food. They have a new middle class coming up in China. They want our products. I think that we're going to have manufacturing coming back to the United States in the next 5 years. In fact, the middle class in China now is buying American products with American flags on it. They want our products because we have quality. The problem is the technology is out of whack right now. It's old. But there's a new manufacturing technology coming in through Germany. I think they're using it. It's called Euromold, where you used to pay engineers huge amounts of money to come up with a prototype for like a hammer. But now it's literally the engineers program the computer so that you have this additive manufacturing so you can have an instant prototype just like that. And who's going to do it the best? People in the United States are going to do it the best. So I think our manufacturing is coming back in the next 5 years. I think real estate will still take a dive in terms of homes, 25% loss still over the next 5 years. But I think land and commodities, it's a great bet.
I'm Art Harris in New Orleans, and I want to thank all of you for sharing your predictions and telling people to fasten their seatbelts for a wild ride.
Thank you, Art.